Let's bring in now Dr. Azar Jammine, Chief Economist at Econometrix. Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Jammine. So given, that South Africa submitted this framework deal in May and revised in June, yet has received no formal response as of today, what realistic outcomes remain, before the August 1 tariff deadline, which of course is tomorrow, do you think?
I don't think that one can be optimistic that there are going to be any concessions to South Africa on the 30% tariff. The only consolation to make is that we are not alone. There are many other countries who are going to be slapped with tariffs even bigger than those to which we are going to be subject. And one has to realize that the notion of slapping tariffs on imports on countries to support American industry, to reverse big trade deficits, are just one reason for why these tariffs are being imposed. It's become quite clear that there are also tariffs are being used as a political ploy. The most classic example of all this has been the 50% tariff that's to be imposed on Brazil. Brazil actually runs a trade deficit with the United States. In other words, it imports more American goods than it exports goods to America. And yet it is being saddled with a 50% tariff because its judiciary is acting to try and incarcerate former President Jair Bolsonaro on grounds of insurrection and attempts at a coup d'etat during the Brazilian elections a couple of years ago. But Bolsonaro is a supporter of Trump, and Trump is trying to punish them punish the Brazilian judiciary for taking this stance. There's a classic example of the manner in which tariffs are being imposed for political, not for economic reasons. Yesterday, we learned that a 25% tariff was going to be imposed on India, and a further tariff was going to be imposed on the country for buying arms from Russia. So again, you can see the political factors at play. Yeah. And in South Africa's case, there are three major political issues at play. Firstly, disgruntlement with South Africa's stance in supporting Russia's perceived support of Russia versus Ukraine. Probably the biggest is the support or the summoning of Israel to the International Court of Justice on accusations of genocide against Palestinians. And the third is the country's stance on black economic empowerment and so-called white genocide. So there are political reasons why the US is imposing these tariffs on South Africa. But South Africa shouldn't despair. You mentioned that it's the second largest export destination for South African exports. Why? Because the majority of those exports are key minerals that the United States needs, such as platinum group metals, chromium, and titanium. And those have been deliberately exempt from import tariffs. So it's a very, very moral attitude that the American government is taking towards this whole thing. Quite clearly, the remaining exports are automotive, agricultural, and as you mentioned, steel and aluminium, which stand to suffer. But in the broader scheme of things, they amount to no more than 3% of South Africa's total exports. So one should not despair.
And I was going to go there, Dr. Jammine, in terms of looking at the sector-specific impacts, because there is a fear that, there will be a great impact in terms of also job losses. But which sectors are more vulnerable? Of course, you mentioned the manufacturing, automotive industry, that could be hardest hit. And the projected scale thereof in terms of loss, what are we likely to see, specifically given, as you also again said, that the US is our second largest trade partner?
Well, the point, as I say, it's the second largest, but take away platinum group metals and chromium and a few other minerals, and the United States is far from the second largest export destination for South African goods. Europe and China are far more important for us. The second point to make is that, if you look at the level of exports to the United States, or car exports last year, automotive, including spare parts. We're talking about 30 to 35 billion rand out of exports of 1.2 trillion rand. In the case of citrus, I'm still keen to see what's going to happen, because we are the second largest citrus exporter in the world after Spain. But our seasons are counter-cyclical. So are Americans going to be starved of buying oranges, or have to pay a hell of a lot more of oranges and stop eating oranges from South Africa because of these tariffs? I'm not so sure. So I still think there's a long, long way to go. And more broadly, I think South Africans are exaggerating this whole episode with the United States. What is holding back economic growth in South Africa are far more important domestic structural impediments to growth, rather than merely our relations with the United States.
And when we look at, of course, the dismantling of AGOA's preferential access, a lot of talk around, what are other avenues that South Africa can then pursue in terms of looking at alternative markets. I mean, such as China, India, the EU also being mentioned there. Of course, the question then becomes in terms of the timelines and, what logistical challenges will they possibly face?
Undoubtedly, there will be logistical challenges, and undoubtedly there will be some losses. But there's one important region that you left out, and that's the rest of Africa.
Yeah.
Africans should get off their butts and start trading far more amongst themselves and opening up the internal market, which over the next 20 years is likely to become one of the biggest in the world, the way things are happening. And South Africa needs to start engaging with other African countries to take advantage of the so-called Africa Continental Free Trade Association agreement. We just haven't seen the benefits thereof. There's a lot of talk, but no action. And African countries are still inclined to put heavy barriers against trade against one another, whether it's out of jealousy, I don't know. But therein lies a huge opportunity for South Africa to take a lead.
And just staying on that point that you mentioned, in terms of Africa, are there sectors with agility now, to pivot versus those that are structurally locked into US demand, if at all?
I do believe certainly Africa is self-sufficient, or could, produce a lot of the agricultural goods that South Africa does. But in terms of manufacturing, we still have, despite its decline and deindustrialization over many decades, we still have the most advanced manufacturing sector in Africa. And we need to try and persuade Africans to start trading more with us and cooperate with them in that way to take advantage of the opportunities there are for South African manufacturers to export more to Africa.
Dr.
and to import more African products from their countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Jammine, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for your analysis. Dr. Azar Jammine is a chief economist at Econometrix, just weighing in, of course, as South Africa is bracing itself for that 30% tariff on its exports to the United States set to take effect tomorrow.